Howdy howdy, and welcome to the channel. I'm Hobby Tom, and today we'll be making this diorama inspired by Space Marine 2. I'm new to the Warhammer community after getting a copy of Space Marine 2, and it inspired me to make this diorama. I picked up 2 starter sets from my local game store and got to work putting them together. First, we need to get them off the sprues, so grab some nippers and get to work. This tool is key to not damaging the parts as we take them off the sprue. We'll need to remove those sprue marks and any mold lines on them as well. These are remnants of the injection molding process that will appear in the final paint job if we don't take care of them now. To remove them, I use an X-Acto knife and some sanding files. The knife can gouge the model if you're not careful, so go slow. The sanding files are spongy so they can handle curved shapes well, and are a high grit so we don't remove too much material at once. The ones I'm using here are between 400 and 1000 grit, but they can go up to 8000. These kits have press-fit models, so they go together without glue. I use a little just to be sure, and it helps remove the seams that may be visible later. I'm using plastic cement instead of superglue to further help this. They feel a little bit like an advanced Lego set, so I think anyone could do these. I will not be gluing most of these models to the bases, since I'll be placing them into a scene later. Off camera, I primed this Space Marine with an Army Painter Primer, Deep Blue, and then gave a directional highlight using Army Painter Primer, Matte White. This lightens up the side that would be facing the bright glow of the flamethrower. I painted all of the armor portions with Citadel's Macragge Blue. I thinned it down with water on my wet palette. This is a thicker base paint, so thinning it down allows us to let those details really shine through. I ended up applying between 2 and 3 coats depending on the side of the model. Next, we can move on to the metallic and leather features of the model using Citadel's Abaddon Black, thinned down of course. I base all of my metals with black first to make sure the color really pops. I learned this from painting chrome at scale, where you prime it with a gloss black first. Testing your paint is a good idea before applying it directly to the model, in case you thinned it down too much or not quite enough. Now we'll move on to the metallic details using Citadel's Balthasar Gold, which to me is really more of a bronze color. I touched up some areas with the same Macragge blue from earlier, and then added some highlights using that blue mixed with a little Corax white and applied it along the edges for a shiny effect. This was my first time edge highlighting, and I'll definitely need some more practice. Adding some white to the details, and then also adding some Army Painter Speed Paint 2.0 blood red to the eyes to make them have that nice glowing effect. I also applied Agrax Earthshade to any of the gold areas to give them a little more depth. Now it's time to move into the Tyranids for the diorama. The starter set came with 3 Termagants, so I'm including those as well as some Hormagaunts. While playing Space Marine 2, I decided that if I was going to be building an army and learning the tabletop game, that I would build a Tyranid army. Preparing these models, we simply follow the same steps as earlier, carefully removing the pieces from the sprues, and remove any blemishes left by the manufacturing process. With the arms of the models, I found that adding the glue after they were in place yielded better results. The extremely thin nature of the glue I'm using really helps seep into those gaps. My current preferred plastic cement is Tamiya Very Thin. I got a box set of Hormagaunts to test out some paint schemes for my Tyranid army. As I was assembling these, I placed the pieces onto the instructions so that I wouldn't miss any pieces or skip any assembly steps. To prime these models, I just did it with Army Painter Primer Matte White. I wanted them to be brighter overall, so I didn't want to do a zenithal or a point highlight for them. Then we'll paint the carapace and other armor with a thinned down Naggaroth Knight by Citadel. Thinning it down lets it sit in the recessed areas of the model and adds some shadow effect with little effort on our part. After the armor plates are painted, we can move on to the flesh portions using Magos Purple Contrast Paint. I do wish I had thinned this color a little further instead of using it directly from the container. I think the effect is a little too pink overall. I applied this fairly generously, more than a wash, to all the portions of the model I had not previously painted, with the exception of the talons and the rifles for the termagants. Next, we'll thin down some Abaddon black to paint the other hard points on the model, including the hooves, talons, and teeth. The Hormagaunts' scythe-like talons really show this well and catch the light once highlighted. Now our model's base coated. The next steps are a great way to add details while still staying in the lines, so to speak. Adding some Army Painter Speed 2.0 Blood Red to the joints adds some variance to this part of the model. The rifles on the termagants are painted with this same red, but because we're painting directly on white, it will be a bolder red. I did not realize that there are eyes on the rifle, and will definitely be painting those on my next batch. Add that same red to the tongue on any models that have them sticking out. Now we'll move on to dry brushing, one of my favorite steps in the process because of how much detail comes from such a simple step. For this, I use Army Painter dry brushes and white paint. Essentially any hobby paint will do. The brush style matters more. I prefer the round brushes with a thick cluster of soft bristles. Makeup brushes work well for this if you have a hard time sourcing hobby-specific brushes. Using a circular or directional stroke with a brush that has barely any paint on it will go over the whole model. This will call out any raised details and lighten the model color overall. We'll use a wooden canvas as our base in this diorama to support the weight of the rubble. To have a good undulating surface, I'm cutting a piece of extruded polystyrene, or XPS foam, to size. The hot wire table is an excellent addition to your hobby setup if you've been working with foam for a while. It cuts faster and cleaner than a knife. Just make sure that your work area is well ventilated. I turn on my airbrush fume hood for this step. To make sure that the foam and wood bond properly, be sure to rough up the edges to get the glue everywhere that it needs to. For the foam, I use a steel brush, and for the wood, I use 60 grit sandpaper. I use wood glue for a sturdy, long-lasting bond, but I add some foam-safe CA glue to speed up my working time. This ensures that I don't have to clamp the pieces and I can start sculpting the terrain right away. Make sure that the CA glue is foam safe, otherwise it will melt the foam. Up next is making the rubble. I wanted to try a new method for this build and had some leftover grout to give it a shot. I recently tiled a storage room in my house and had some of this sandless grout that I left in a plastic bin lid. I just broke it up into usable pieces using an old hammer and some beat up diagonal cutters. I saved some of the larger pieces to break down slowly and then fit them into larger wall sections. This allowed me to rough in the layout of the diorama and make sure I was getting the ruined building look I wanted. Adding detail to these pieces by clipping off small chunks and then carving in impact marks adds a nice battlefield aesthetic. Once I was content with the layout, I took the pieces off in a manner that I felt I could remember so I could add in the base terrain. Let's begin by mixing up some Sculptamold. This is a plaster product with paper pulp incorporated. This creates a strong bond and sets quickly. The working time is usually around 20 minutes, but you can work out finer details for a little while after that if additional water is added by misting the surface. Another added benefit is that it protects the foam from melting when we prime it with spray paint. Spread it out all over the surface with a wooden utensil or your hands. A thin layer is all we really need for most of the surface. Wherever we want the walls or larger pieces of terrain, some thicker patches will help keep everything in place. Add in the rubble wherever it feels needed, and if the pieces are particularly large, add some more Sculptamold to the back of it like it's cream cheese getting smeared onto a bagel. Then we're going to sprinkle in some increasingly smaller stones to work down to sand or gravel scale sized pieces. Using talus stones and basin grit or model railroad grit works great. Add in a hearty amount of scenic glue to lock everything into place. I don't think I added enough, and you'll see the consequences to that soon. Scenic glue is just watered down PVA glue. You can work it into the cracks by misting the surface before and after. Protecting the rest of the exposed foam with Mod Podge is necessary, since I'll be using spray paint to prime this. We can cut up some guitar strings and bend them into various shapes to act as scale rebar. The wrapped nature of this wire lends well to the effect of rebar from a distance at scale. Just drill some small holes, place the wire, and use some CA glue to hold it in place. This glue allows you to bend the wires after the fact to whatever shape you want. I primed this model off camera with Army Painter Primer Matte Black. I did a brief airbrush test, but wanted to add some blue undercolor first. I used a teal hobby paint to dry brush on that blue hue. Unfortunately, I went a little too heavy-handed with the airbrushing, and the effect does not really shine through in the final model. Next, we'll move on to airbrushing. I love using the airbrush for this step because it preserves all the detail that we worked to create. And here we can see the problem of not properly gluing down the basing material. I came in with a can of compressed air to clean out the loose stones and then kept on airbrushing. I mixed up a bottle of concrete gray for this project because I knew I'd be using a fair amount. It's a blend of Army Painter Air Matte White Primer and Vallejo Air Black in a 9:2 mixture with a little bit of extra thinner added in. I sprayed this fairly heavily on all the large pieces of rubble and much lighter on the base. Then we'll paint the sides of the base with Vallejo black primer before moving on to the weathering. Using that same black, I added in some shadows to the concrete walls and then a little more to the carbon scoring of areas where I think explosions would have happened. I mixed up an acrylic wash using Mars Black and some water. I applied this wash using a dropper to get it into the deep recesses of the model. After that, I used a brush to touch it along the edges of all the concrete and then added a little water just so it would seep down and not be so much on the surface. Applying the wash heavily on a surface and then blotting it gives a nice patchy concrete effect. Flinging the wash from your brush, creating little spots and speckles, adds a texture to the concrete as well. A white dry brushing will really help call out those details on the broken walls. Just hit the edges and don't lighten up too many of your shadows. With that, we're ready to glue our models into place. I like using CA glue in both a gel and liquid form for this step. The gel is good for the feet to get them firmly planted, and the liquid will attach smaller pieces, barely making contact elsewhere. And now, I think we've got a great scene inspired by Space Marine 2. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you get to make something wonderful soon. Take care until next time.